Well, good evening. Been looking forward to this for some time. My name is John Roy, pastor here at Pelham Road, and our July book of the month is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. All right. Today's session I'm going to do by myself. There'll be some other sessions where I'm joined by other folks, I hope. So let's begin our introduction by asking ourselves some questions. Why do we read? Well, I would suspect that one reason is that we need to be entertained, and reading is a good form of entertainment. Another reason we read is to be informed, to learn. At times, if you remember adolescence and childhood, you're told to read, and so we read because we are made to read. Now, can we read something, anything, without forming meaning to the events we are reading about? Well, many times we read right over things and fail to see anything other than the words on the page. We probably did that as adolescents a lot, and maybe as adults we do it some when we're falling asleep. While a book needs to entertain us, to keep us interested, it can also be doing a lot more than entertaining us. And that's what's going on here. There's a lot more than just a good story and being entertained. So now we turn and say, all right, why do we write? Why does anyone write? Well, I guess the simplest way to begin that conversation is to say that they have something to say. Something that maybe we feel needs to be said, and we think the best way to convey that information is by writing it down. Now, it's practically impossible to write without forming meaning to what we are writing. I mean, we can read without forming meaning from time to time, but it's almost impossible to write without forming meaning to what we are writing. In truth, writing is actually informed by meaning. In other words, the meaning comes first and then the writing comes. We have a message, and we use words to sort of share the message. And as a writer, the value is actually in the message that we're sending, not the words that we're writing. The value is in the message that we're trying to send. So, this month, we're going to explore Frankenstein. Written in, do you know what year it was written? 1818. So it's over 200 years old, actually. And during this summer book club, I really wanted us to read from some books that we would never normally read, and from some sources we wouldn't normally have, and some new perspectives that we've forgotten about. And so I felt like turning the clock back and reading something that's 200 years old, and reading something that's written by a woman when very few women wrote, would be a new perspective, a new way of hearing some material. Now, strictly speaking, if you've ever done a book review, any evaluation of a book must begin with a study of the author. Frankenstein is more than you think, and Mary Shelley is writing much more than fiction. So let's talk in this first session a good deal about the author, Mary Shelley. Born in 1797, she died in 1851. Okay? Her father was the political philosopher William Goodwin, and her mother was the philosopher and feminist activist Mary Wollstonecraft. You can look that up. Mary Wollstonecraft. W-O-L-L Stonecraft. Now, William Goodwin was an author and political philosopher. He's best known for a work called An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. And then he wrote a piece called Things as They Are, or The Adventures of Caleb Williams, which was an early mystery novel. He was a bit of a radical. Now remember, this is 1800s, late 1700s. But undoubtedly, his radical perspective is what sort of attracted him to Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary was an early feminist. Now the thing is, in America, we think everything sort of started here, and it's easy for us to think that feminism started in the 60s, or if you want to say it started with Susan B. Anthony. Well, that's our perspective. But Mary would like to have a word with you, because she was a feminist in the late 1700s. During her brief career, Mary, the mother now, this is not Mary Shelley, this is Mary's mother. During her career, she wrote novels, a travel mystery, a history of the French Revolution, a conduct book, and a children's book. But her best-known book is A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was published in 1792. Published in 1792. In which she argued that women are not naturally inferior to men, but only appear so because they are not educated. She suggested if you educated men and women equally, you would see that there's no difference between the two. Now, Mary, the mother, was no saint. She had two illicit affairs, and in one case, she actually had a child from one of the men. And I call them affairs, but they really happened prior to her marriage. She married William Goodwin, as I said, and unfortunately, Mary, the mother, died at the age of 38. She died 11 days after giving birth to Mary Shelley, her second daughter. After her mother's death, her father provided Mary with, I guess, what we would consider an unconventional sort of education. As you might imagine, there was a limit to formal education women received in the early 1800s. A very limited education did women receive in the early 1800s. But being born into the home of a feminist and a political philosopher, you can imagine that there was no limit to Mary's informal education. Now, in 1814, she began a romance with one of her father's political followers, Percy Shelley. Now, Percy was already married. And at the age of 16, Mary, with her stepsister Claire, left with Percy for France and traveled through Europe. Now, you may think, you wouldn't send your 16-year-old daughter or son on a European vacation. But, again, this is a little bit unconventional. Now, when they returned to England, Mary was pregnant with Percy's child, and Percy was still married at the time. And over the course of the pregnancy and the time after the pregnancy for a while, Percy and Mary faced ridicule. They were pushed to the edge of the society and debt. And then things got further complicated in that the child was born but soon died as an infant. Now they married, Percy and Mary married in 1816. Mary was 18 years old at the time, and Percy Shelley's first wife had committed suicide. In 1816, now follow this very closely, in 1816, Percy, Mary, her stepsister, And Lord Byron and Lord Byron's physician, a guy by the name of John Poldery, went to Geneva, Switzerland. And this is where it gets interesting. They went to Switzerland, and this is now 1816, and this is where Frankenstein is written. Frankenstein was published in 1818, if you need a timeline. So in 1816, they go to Geneva. In 1818, the book is published. And in 1816, she writes this book while they're traveling together in Geneva. Now, just to go back to the family for a moment, the Shelleys left Britain in 1818 to live in Italy. And their second and third child were born, but they also died. Only their fourth child was the only child to survive infancy, Percy Florence Shelley. Now, if you didn't think this lady's life had enough tragedy, in 1822, her husband Percy drowns in a sailing boat accident during a unexpected storm. So after that, Mary returns to England and devotes herself to the upbringing of her son and her career as an author. Now, nobody can really be separated from the times in which they lived and wrote. And so I've got to explain a little bit of what was going on in the world during the late 1700s and the early 1800s. The Age of Enlightenment, and I know this will be a little bit of history for some of you. You remember this from college. Some of you, it's on the tip of your tongue. But usually the dates for the Enlightenment are like 1715 to like the late 1700s, maybe 1785, 1790, thereabouts. The Enlightenment was an intellectual and philosophical movement that sort of dominated Europe in these days. Now, this was the era prior to Mary's birth. But this was the era of her mother and father. This is what influenced her mom and dad. And the Enlightenment was a time in which the ideas centered around the pursuit of happiness, the sovereignty of reason. Now, in addition to the Age of Enlightenment, there was also the Industrial Revolution going on. Now, the Industrial Revolution in Europe is usually dated, I believe, 1760 to the mid-1800s. Well, maybe 1825 to 1835, 1840. And the Industrial Revolution was this time when there was a great transition going on in the way we produced materials. We had new chemical manufacturing, we had new machines, we had new processes for doing things. We continued to increase the use of steam power and water power. There were development of many new machine tools and the rise of the factory. And the Industrial Revolution had quite an effect on the citizens. There was unprecedented population growth, and the Industrial Revolution brought people from the countryside into the city. And so you had people becoming urban for the first time. Now, of course, the textiles were the dominant industry in the Industrial Revolution in terms of employment and the value of capital and the capital invested. The textile industry was also the first to use most modern production methods. And the Industrial Revolution, of course, began in Great Britain. So I just want you to keep everything straight. So let me pause for a moment. Mary wrote Frankenstein after she had witnessed the effects of the Industrial Revolution for about 50 to 60 years. Now, of course, she was a late teenager, but she has witnessed what has went on and how the world has changed in her 15, 16, 18 years. And probably the conversations around the dinner table with her mom and her dad and the effects of the Industrial Revolution. Now further, the Age of Reason, or Enlightenment, had laid the foundation for this work in science and technology. It is quite likely that it was that foundation that allowed for the Industrial Revolution to take place. Now, this particular era that Shelley wrote in, Mary Shelley, is called the Romantic era. So let's add that to our list. The Romantic era was a time of artistic and literary and musical and intellectual movement that originated in Europe around the end of the 1700s, the beginning of the 1800s. And Romanticism was characterized by an emphasis on individualism and nature and an emphasis upon emotions. As is most movements, it is a reaction to previous movements. And so this is a bit of a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the Age of the Enlightenment. This movement emphasized emotion as an authentic source of experience, which was new. It placed new emphasis upon apprehension and horror and awe and terror. Perfect for a book about Frankenstein, or a book like Frankenstein. Now, I'd like to provide you just a little bit of a timeline as I end this, because I think timelines help us put things in perspective. All right? So, in 1667, Paradise Lost is written, and John Milton's book, Paradise Lost, becomes sort of the central hub of which all literature for a while flows around. It influences a lot of things. It's actually mentioned in this book, Frankenstein. In 1712, the steam engine is invented, so you can see the Industrial Revolution cranking up. 1764, the spinning jenny is invented, which, again, was another instrument in the Industrial Revolution. 1773, Boston Tea Party. Something's happening on the other side of the pond. 1775, Jane Austen is born. 1776, of course, the Declaration of Independence. 1789, the French Revolution. 1789, also, George Washington becomes the first U.S. president. But in 1794, the Industrial Revolution continues with the cotton gin being invented. And right after that, in 1797, our author, Mary Shelley, is born. In 1799, the Rosetta Stone is discovered in Egypt. In 1803, Louisiana Purchase happens. In 1809, Edgar Allan Poe is born. In 1812, put this in perspective, in 1812, Charles Dickens is born. So in 1813, 1 year after Dickens is born, Pride and Prejudice is published by Jane Austen. So in 1813, Pride and Prejudice comes out, and in 1818, Frankenstein comes out, the first work of science fiction. 1819, Walt Whitman is born. 1839, Charles Dickens gets Oliver Twist published. 1851, Mary Shelley dies. All right? So that gives you a timeline of when we're talking about and what's happening. Okay? And who our author is. Next week, and I hope you're reading the book already. I hope you've read the whole book. If you haven't, I hope you're at least a good portion into it. Next week, I sit down and we start talking about the text itself, the story itself, and how its meaning, and how it confronts us with who we are and what we create and what our world is becoming. So, see you then.